All right, so it is 12:05, so hopefully, we'll get some more people joining us as we go, but I'll go ahead and get started. We'll move from starting soon to started here. Um, like I said, I have just a small number of notes to read, one of which is to welcome everyone to Delivery Exception. This is a little speaker series we've organized for this spring, bringing together scholars, organizers, different kinds of people working on supply chains and logistics to give some short talks intersecting with the theme of logistical justice to hopefully help us all think about what possibilities there might be for reconciliation in our current era of supply chain capitalism. So the credits that I would offer here is that this event is free and open to the public. It's organized as part of the Supply Studies Research Network, a group of scholars, students, activists, and organizers who have identified an active interest in the critical study of logistics. The research network itself is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities Office of Digital Humanities. Funding and additional support for this series is provided by the Conference of Arts and Science Deans and the Department of Communication and Media Studies here at Fordham. This is a virtual event, so obviously the geographies that are enrolled in our gathering here today are, many, but I would like to acknowledge that Fordham itself occupies the ancestral lands of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger peoples. Before I introduce our speakers for today, I just want to go ahead and give a preview of the rest of the upcoming events we have planned for the spring. Our next event is Wednesday, February 21st at noon. We have Armin Beverangen, Miley Vogt, and Ulf Traeger from Leuphana University Lundberg. On Wednesday, March 6th at 7 p.m., we have Christina Dunbar-Hester and Athena Tan. Christina Dunbar-Hester is from the University of Southern California, and Athena Tan is from Plugin IE, where IE there is Inland Empire. On March 18th at 6 p.m., we have Miriam Posner from the University of California, Los Angeles. And last but not least, on Wednesday, March 27th, we have our final event featuring Benjamin McKean from Ohio State University, Jessica Champagne from the Worker Rights Consortium, and Henelis Solis from Make the Road Action. So, our speakers today are Jess Bier, who's giving a talk entitled Scheduling Ship Pilots, Labor and Logistical Algorithms Under Racial Capitalism. Jess Bier is an associate professor of urban sociology at Erasmus University Rotterdam. Jess's research analyzes the unjust social and political geographies of digital infrastructures. Her first book, Mapping Israel, Mapping Palestine, How Occupied Landscapes Shape Scientific Knowledge, was published in 2017 by MIT Press, and Jess is currently the PI of the ERC-funded project DIGIPORTS, a study of how the digitalization of ports is reshaping the racialization of logistical workers and vice versa. And after Jess's talk, we'll have Jessica Steinman, who will be delivering a presentation titled Out of Sync, Pay, Work, and Temporal Inequalities Among Vietnamese Seafarers. Jessica Steinman is a postdoctoral researcher at Erasmus University Rotterdam. She earned her D.Phil degree in Social Anthropology from Leipzig University, where she taught courses on migration and diaspora studies. She has conducted extensive fieldwork on Vietnamese migrants and their experiences negotiating identity, belonging, and mobility in translocal communities in several countries, including Germany, Taiwan, the United States, and Russia. Her current research focuses on labor, mobility, and power inequalities in container shipping and logistics in the Netherlands, Vietnam, and Singapore. Her research analyzes the effect of digital transformations on the immobility of labor and the mobility of goods through the temporal experiences of logistical workers and seafarers. The question of how people's immobility intersects with the unequal valuation of labor through the movement of goods has been central to this work, and her work draws on a range of theoretical frameworks, including post-colonial theory, feminist theory, and critical race theory, to explore how labor, mobility, and power intersect in the context of racial capitalism. So like I said, we'll begin with Jess Bier. Jess, whenever you'd like to start.
Sure. And let me share my screen.
Oh, and I actually, before you start, I should say, if anyone has any questions, we'll have a little bit of Q&A time at the end where you can voice with your microphone your question, or you're welcome to put it into this Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your Zoom interface. All right, sorry, go ahead, Jess.
Sure. And can you guys see my screen? Is that okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so as Matt said, I'm Jess Bier, and today I'm going to be talking about ship pilots and specifically an algorithm for scheduling and for making visible when ship pilots are on board ships. But before doing that, I wanted to introduce the DIGIPORTS project just a little bit to sort of give you a sense for the context of why we're doing this work. So I'm the PI on the project, as Matt said, and Jessica is the postdoc. We also have one PhD and hopefully another PhD who's starting soon. And I think especially Jessica and my projects are, we're looking at complementary connected sites and workers, but they're also very different. So it's sort of nice, I thought, to have us both speak and talk about what we're doing. This is really work in progress. So there's a lot still that I really want to know and think about further, but at least maybe you can get a sense of the flavor of the kind of work that we're doing. So yeah, the tagline for the DIGIPORTS project is that we're studying how digitalization reshapes racialization and actually vice versa, right? So how racialization shapes the way that digital tools are developed and implemented. And for this, I can only speak sort of personally, but when I first started formulating the project, I was interested in bringing together STS and critical logistics, which is also sort of my theoretical background, also from my previous work. So I wanted to, do sort of STS ethnographic studies of practice and variation on a smaller scale, but also think about the ways that structures and systemic injustice is imminent in the everyday. So think also about analyses of systemic change of the kind that you find more in critical logistics or critical geography, where racial capitalism happens to be very influential. And I really began formulating this project because I wanted to better understand the co-articulations of capitalism with other forms of oppression like white supremacy and patriarchy. So rather than, thinking a priori about how these things are related, I wanted to study them ethnographically. And digital technology happens to provide a very, unfortunately, in a way, interesting opportunity to do that. So I want to think about how capitalism and white supremacy go together at times, and at other times, maybe they strategically feed off each other or contradict in ways that, you can select one over the other, or different strategies from different kinds of repression can be used in a particular incident. Now, in terms of shipping, logistics, I probably don't have to explain a lot about this to this audience, but logistics is central to global capitalism, to the working of global capitalism. So I had done a postdoc on finance and the STS of finance, and I was interested in getting back to the stuff and the things that move around and the resources and the extraction, the colonial extraction that's central to global networks. So that's why shipping. Thinking about racial capitalism, I think, is necessary in terms of studying shipping, and you've seen this in the critical logistics literature, because shipping is so explicitly stratified by race and racial categorization. So it's an industry where people are explicitly, and like Jessica, you might talk about this in your part, but people are explicitly paid differently. They have different job conditions. They have different access to training. They have different qualifications based upon a number of factors that are tied to race. So including things like, national origin, place of birth, language, accent, and a host of other factors. Your positioning within North global South power systems and hierarchies. And just a number of other conditions. So it also allows a way to study articulations of race beyond North America and Europe, but also in relation to, the control of North America and Europe and global white supremacy. So I think if you're looking at shipping, it makes a lot of sense, unfortunately, to look at racialization and changing racialization. In terms of digitalization, one of the things that's interesting about digitalization and shipping is that a lot of it is happening right now. So shipping, as you guys probably know, digitalized later, or a lot of the sort of implementation of algorithms and AI and machine learning happened a bit later than they did in other areas of logistics. So digitalization is ongoing, which I think by itself makes it interesting and important to study. But also, I mean, I think I kept coming back to this idea that, you know, digital tech is always presented with this hype that there's going to be like a new system, a new, you know, the spread of democracy, whether you see that as positive or negative. You know, it's going to bring about a revolution in social relations. And then if the last 20 or 30 years have taught us anything, what happens is new tools are rolled out, and instead of them, you know, reconfiguring capitalism, capitalism reconfigures the tools. So you're put in a situation where there's a lot of changes and really like basic material changes in people's everyday lives. But somehow, despite all of this complexity and all of these articulations, injustice is what falls out, and often very familiar forms of injustice. So in terms of, you know, shipping and digitalization is an ongoing phenomenon in shipping, I was sort of interested in the ways that things like whiteness are reproduced despite going through a period of monumental change. And Rotterdam happens to be one of the most digital ports in the world. So that's kind of how the project got started. And now we've expanded. So Jessica's looking at Singapore, which is also another one of the most digitalized ports in the world, but also looking at ports in Vietnam, which, you know, on paper aren't viewed as being extensively digitalized, but perhaps, as she'll talk about today, in fact, people use a whole host of, you know, online tools and platforms to navigate the port. It's just that it's not being done from a top-down perspective. So that by itself is also interesting as a different articulation of these, you know, systemic change. So that's a lot of words, but that is sort of the context for studying ship pilots and studying this algorithm for controlling, or at least shaping, ship pilots' labor. So now what I want to do with the rest of the time is to talk a little bit about ship pilots and give you guys a sense of the kind of work that I'm doing now, and actually hopefully hope to do more of in the near future. So maybe it's worth saying something about who ship pilots are. I know many of you probably are familiar if you've done work in this area, but just to give you a sense, to start on the same page. And I can say that, you know, there have been scholars who've written extensively on pilots. So like Ashley Carse, C-A-R-S-E, I know has written about ship pilots in the Panama Canal, and work that's really helpful as I formulated this. But so what are ship pilots? Ship pilots are people who board large container ships right outside of port. So usually there's a defined sort of boundary, and they guide the ship into port. Ship pilots are often employed by the local port authority or the local port corporation. In Rotterdam, ship pilots actually have their own corporation that they were shareholders of, which is sort of an interesting articulation all by itself. But I think the person or the figure of the ship pilot is really interesting. And now I can only speak of the Rotterdam context at the moment. But here's a figure, you know, you have container ships coming, extracting resources and sometimes, you know, often produced goods from the global south, bringing them to Rotterdam, the largest port in Europe, so sort of this gateway to Europe. And then you have sort of a local figure going onto the ship and driving the ship into port. And there are, you know, reasons why ship pilots exist, especially in Rotterdam. You know, these are deltas, and like a lot of ports, they're deltas or waterways that are changing and have to continually be redredged. So the ship pilot is someone who has the kind of tacit local knowledge of the current conditions and the changing weather conditions and bottom conditions that allows them to make sure, or to hopefully prevent accidents aboard ships. Ship pilots in Rotterdam, at least, it's traditionally considered like a white male working class occupation, but they're actually someone who sort of straddles this divide between sort of the workers in the port and the data workers, who often work for the port authority, but work sort of semi-offsite in many cases. And that is also interesting because it's kind of like a rugged masculinity, like they do the dangerous work of guiding the ships into port. And it's not dangerous on a day-to-day level, but there is always, you know, the theoretical possibility that conditions could pose a serious danger to them or to others. But they also possess a wealth of they're highly trained. They possess a wealth of technical knowledge. They do use a lot of data and instruments. So they sort of, pin what traditionally has been a divide. And they sort of, they're the linchpin in a traditional sort of class divide within the port. So in terms of ship pilots, I'm kind of interested in looking at, they're one of the more privileged groups in the port. They tend to have local passports and have local labor protections, which is not true for a lot of workers, even those who work in the port. It depends a lot on the specific person and the specific job. So they have all of the protections. They receive more attention from people rolling out pilots of like new apps and platforms because they perform this really crucial role of making sure the ships arrive safely and on time. But at the same time, they do very much represent sort of an older ethos of the tacit knowledge of sailing and of, the Rotterdam port area. So that's kind of interesting also as well in terms of what ship pilots do. So I'm interested in studying them as like looking at the reproduction of whiteness as their job changes through the use of digital tools. And digital tools are kind of being rolled out for ship pilots. They use a lot of data already, but still to date, the ships are often driven manually into the port. So they come in, they stand on the bridge, the ship captain, retreats a little bit, at least in theory, and the pilot still is doing the physical driving, and the steering of the ship into the port. Another reason in a study on digitalization to look at ship pilots is that they're considered one of the jobs that's the hardest to automate. So that's also interesting as well. A lot of tools are being developed for them, but to date, even people who were sort of, developing, out of the box autonomous ships, small pilots in universities like Delft, where they do a lot of engineering, there's no goal of automating ship pilots just yet. Of course, it'll probably come down the line, but they're the ones, if anybody does a job that really needs sort of a specific combination of different kinds of knowledge that are considered special to humans, for better or worse, ship pilots kind of embody that. So for that reason, they're also interesting as well. So my project as a whole doesn't focus on ship pilots. They're just one part. They're kind of what I've started working with. But at the same time, when I was, attending courses in the port and going to shipping technology conferences, I started to hear about this platform called Pilot Tracker that was specifically aimed at tracking ship pilots. And so, of course, I started to pay attention, and I thought it sounded really interesting. So this is an example of Pilot Tracker. It's basically it's an online platform, but it's basically just a website where people who have login credentials, so it's not publicly available, but they can go. And you see the ships. So these are ships coming into Rotterdam. And the website basically just lets you know the name of the ship, the scheduled time of arrival, and a bunch of other sort of standard information that you get from positioning, AIS, for example. But then what it does is the thing that's different is that it colors the ships according to whether or not the pilot are on board. So you can see here yellow vessels, either that don't need pilots because they're smaller, but these are likely bigger container ships that are these, especially out here, are bigger container ships that don't have pilots yet. And then the pink ships are the ships that have pilots on board. The reason this matters is because once getting the pilot on board is one of the sort of traffic jams that happens when a ship is trying to enter a large port like Rotterdam. So you want to once the pilot is on board, you can kind of get a realistic picture of when the ship will arrive. Doesn't mean it can berth. So that's another stopgap, is like trying to park or berth the ships. But at least getting the pilot on board is sort of like a hurdle that ships have to clear. And once the pilot is there, you can start to think about knowing when your ship is going to be available and unload. So this information is very interesting, for example, for people who, not usually individual shippers, but companies that are shipping large amounts, companies that are in charge of the ships, liner companies, etc. So I started hearing about this platform, and perhaps naively, but I kind of thought, oh, there's a platform called Pilot Tracker. I wonder if they're going to give the pilots wearables And then the pilots are going to have like a GPS device or some other, positioning device, or maybe an app on their phone where the pilot is going to then, be tracked, and they'll know when the pilot goes on board the ship. And I wonder what that's going to mean for the way that the pilots work. Well, it turns out that even in sort of a highly digitalized and automated port like Rotterdam, that's not quite how it works. This looks relatively clean, but it's not actually. But the interesting thing is, and it's sort of marketed as, we have a machine learning algorithm that's going to tell you when your pilot is going to get on board and when your ship is going to arrive. So you can see here, like it says ET pilot on estimated time the pilot will go on board. And they do that using historic data for similar conditions, based from this platform of when a ship arrived, when the pilot got on board, and when the ship was birthed. So it seems relatively sort of, I won't say innovative, but like it's using more recent tech. But one thing that's interesting is that there's no wearables involved in this. Like the pilots, they don't have an app, they don't have a device, they're not actually being tracked directly. The way that, that ship changes from yellow to pink is that you have a person behind the scenes doing it. And this is an example of one such person. I should say he's not in Rotterdam, he's actually in the north, in Eemshaven. But this is a dispatcher. So this is the same job or the same worker who has always scheduled the pilots for as long, since, middle of the 20th century, say. It's a person. So what happens is, it's not that the pilot suddenly gets a notification in an app, gets in a car, on a train, usually in a car, and goes to the port and gets on a ship. No, there's someone who calls the pilot, and often like it can be via WhatsApp. So he gets a notification, but from WhatsApp, because this guy, and his name happens to be Samir, calls him up and says, hey, you got to go. Yeah, you need to go to this dock. You need to go here, get on the ship. You're going to blah, 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 blah. So I kind of like, idealistically, but also not necessarily in a positive sense, but thought that, oh, they have a pilot tracker. There's going to be some new fancy scheduling algorithm for helping these pilots get to the ships to help, make the time be used, more, quote unquote, more efficiently, which is a big concern. But no, actually, it's a website, and the same person who's always scheduled the pilots is still scheduling. The only difference is he clicks a button and turns the ship pink, right? And then afterwards, they use that data that a person has input to run a machine learning algorithm to estimate it for the future. So what's interesting here is that Rotterdam is super highly digitalized. They're thinking about selling data, about having new data positions, talking about autonomous ships. There are autonomous cranes and trucks, cars already, etc. And then one of their new sort of like fancy pilot programs is just a guy named Samir, who I'm sure does a great job, but he's doing the same job he's always done. So why does that matter? Well, there's two things. One is that even though he's doing the job he's always done, the pilot's arrival is now more visible to the people who are paying to make the ship go and who have a very, powerful role within the port ecosystem. So in some ways it actually, pressures them to work faster, to be more available than ever. So on the one side, it's accelerating the pace of movement through the port, and especially for the pilots, so even for these relatively privileged, highly paid, highly skilled workers. So that's the one side. On the other side, it's not actually helping with any of the problems that pilots face in terms of scheduling. So this slide gives you a sense of just one of the kinds of problems that pilots talk about. And this is actually from a video that's on YouTube that you can watch if you care. And so this is a pilot. He's talking to an interviewer. So he's the guy on the left in both photos, and then the interviewer is the guy on the right. And he's saying, during my work week, I'm sleeping or I'm working, and then I'm not expected to pick up the kids from school. And then he starts listing things that he misses. So he's like, small kids require a lot of work. They have to go to daycare. And then he goes like, they have to go to school. We used to go to church. Sometimes there would be birthdays. Sometimes someone would get sick, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what he does is, the interviewer asks him like, how do you like your job? And he says, oh, I like a lot of things about it. I would do it again if I could, but And then he lists all of these things that he misses on a regular basis. The reason why he misses them is because the one, and possibly one of the only downsides to being a pilot, is that they often work what's called a 7-on, 7-off schedule. So their schedules are relatively inflexible. So that means that they work for 7 days straight, and then they're off for 7 days straight. Which, you know, in theory doesn't sound too bad, but the thing is, when they work for 7 days straight, what he's emphasizing here is that it's not that you go to work and you come home, he's on call 24/7. So it's kind of like being an EMT or an ambulance driver in a lot of places, or someone working in an ER. Like, when he works for 7 days, they can literally call him at any time. And any time that he's not driving the ship, he's sleeping to make sure he doesn't crash the ship from lack of sleep. So he really does nothing. He says it's like, I'm not there. And it's not something that he's, you know, I think especially proud of or happy about. So scheduling in the port as a whole is incredibly complex. One of the ways back when people were, even though now, but like when people are doing the majority of the scheduling, one of the ways they simplified that was to make the workers, you know, fully available when they're on. So for 7 days, he has to be fully available to the system. One of the potential benefits of algorithms, I mean, and this is debatable, but in theory, you could consider having a scheduling platform for port workers that would allow people to do things like exchange shifts while still remaining within the constraints of labor laws, you know, not working too much, because they're like airplane pilots, they can't overwork for fear of it being in danger, at least officially. So they could exchange days if, you know, your child has a birthday, or they could exchange days if someone's really sick and you need to take care of them. If things pop up unexpectedly, in theory, you could have an algorithmic platform that would facilitate that and mean that they no longer have to do a 7-on, 7-off shift. So one of the things that's interesting about, you know, this platform, wait, I put it there, yeah, this platform not being especially you know, fancy or interesting from a technological perspective, is that they have to be more available because they're being watched more closely, but they don't get any of the benefits that in theory would go along with that. Now, keep in mind, the pilots might not want to be tracked. I'm not sure I would in their position, even though they have a lot of their privacy laws, there's the EU data laws, they have a lot of protections. But also you don't even have to track them to get some of the benefits from that algorithmic scheduling might allow. It's just, and what you see here is not, you know, a natural outcome of the technology. You see the way the platform has been shaped and in whose interest it's been shaped. So what becomes clear, like from looking at this platform in depth, is that the pilots and their interests don't even really, like, they're very visible on the platform, but they haven't been involved in developing this technology at all. No one has interviewed them. No one has asked them how they use the app. There's no user experience for the pilots being developed. There are people asking, representatives of liner companies and people from other, you know, more powerful positions who are watching the ships go and who are sort of checking the bottom line, like, is the port moving the ships quickly and efficiently? Those people are asked, and their interests are actually the ones that, you know, shape the way that this website looks and what it's able to do and what it's not able to do. That's important because if there were any group of workers, you know, aside from data workers themselves, but if there are any group of like data analysts, for example, if there are any group of workers where you would expect that maybe they would have been consulted on the rollout of digital tech in Rotterdam, the pilots would be it, right? Because they have this sort of visible, important, et cetera, position, the fact that they weren't even asked is by itself notable. There is another, you know, but then there's a whole other side to this, and I won't, let me check my time. Yeah. This is, I think, my last slide, and then I'll hand it over to Jessica. But so one of the things that the algorithm does is it shows sort of the limitations of digitalization and also the way that digitalization is being shaped by existing interests. That's part A. Part B, and what we're really sort of getting to now, is that digitalization shows that some of the same hierarchies that you see that have been extensively critiqued in the literature on racial capitalism are then, if anything, hardened and made more extreme. And so I'll just briefly sort of introduce one of those, and then we'll move on. So the pilots don't get a great deal, even though this app isn't tracking them, which they might appreciate. The pilots don't get a great deal of benefit from the pilot tracker algorithm. But what I will say is the pilots are visible as pilots in this, as workers, they're very visible in this platform. It's named for them. There's, different colors, they show up, there's a flag. You're very aware, if you're looking at this, that pilots are an important part of the labor of the port. What you don't see here are any of the other workers necessary for, this exchange to take place. Now, a lot of the workers in the port are actually off the screen because this is really sort of out by the open ocean, which is in the bottom right. But there are a lot of workers who should be on that screen who aren't, and those are the workers who are on board the ship. So what you have is this group of white male visible workers who are locals, who are Europeans, and then the vast majority who, it's one person per ship. And then you have the vast majority of the workers in this picture who don't show up at all. And those are, the shipboard workers, often hailing from countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, and Jessica will also talk about Vietnam, but a number of countries, mostly beyond Europe, but not entirely, who are doing the work that are bringing the ship in. So even as the pilot's driving the ship, they're, doing work to maintain the ship and make sure everything goes. What's interesting there from a perspective of racial capitalism is that, the pilots show up as human beings, but the majority of the workers in the quote unquote, in the picture that I showed you, so on the platform, they're just conceptualized as part of the ship, right? And there's a long history thinking about people of color and Black people being simply, a part of the machinery or being made to fade into the background whenever there's new tech rollout. And people like Edward Jones and Hotep has written about this, right? Whenever you have like a new automated loom, there's like 500 small children in the background making sure that it keeps working. And you see that also, for example, like with Amazon's Mechanical Turk, where the vast majority of workers doing micro tasks are not generally visible, although now there's been a lot of work on that as well. So from a racial capitalism perspective, this divide between some workers who are made visible, human, agentive, autonomous, and workers who are simply part of the technical machinery is being hardened and made more extreme, even by something kind of innocuous, like this website showing you when your ship turns pink. So one of the things I want to look at moving forward is to think about what this means in terms of, the reproduction of whiteness through tech in seemingly innocuous ways, but in ways that then have a lot of impact upon shipboard workers and seafarers. So for example, the only way that these seafarers show up as humans in the digital tech for Rotterdam so far is when they show up as a potential threat. So there's another system where they have to enter their passport details and sort of confirm that they're not bringing in anything, potentially dangerous substances, which is hilarious for a variety of reasons. But so they don't show up ever as workers who might have rights, who might get ill, who might have kids that they're missing as well, who might have other relationships with other people, biological or chosen family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In places they're not visible at all as even as potential human beings. So thinking about what that means, and if you take the literature on racial capitalism and a lot of work that's been done at the Atlantic and combine it with work on the Indian Ocean, also thinking further beyond that, which Jessica will talk about, I want to think about how this re-articulates race and racial hierarchies in new ways, because a lot of the work on Black studies has thought about, forms of enslavement and how enslavement is a different category or different kind of work. It's not just wage labor with no wage. Here, what you see is on the one hand, they do get a wage. And some people talk about, like it being nice to be able to send money home to your family on the one hand, but on the other hand, all things that have been applied. So thinking about things like fugitivity, definitions of the human, et cetera, things that have been applied to enslaved people, unfortunately, for a long time, and concepts that have been used in the literature, also are surprisingly resonant when you start to think about seafarers' work. So on the one hand, they're wage laborers. On the other hand, they don't appear as humans in the digital tools that are being developed now. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about now and where I'm going. Yeah, and that's it. And now I will stop sharing my screen and hand things over to Jessica.
Hi, thank you, Jess, for the presentation and handing things over. I will start sharing my screen now. Let's see if you can see. Okay, can you see my screen just fine? And can you hear me fine? Because I tend to mumble. Anyway, my name is Jessica Steinman. I'm a postdoc in Jess's ERC project, and today I'm going to talk about Vietnamese seafarer and about the temporal inequality that they experience. Obviously, the inequality is more than temporal, but the focus here is mainly on time. It doesn't have a lot to do with digitalization yet, but I think that we're getting toward that at the end. In any case, so study of how time and social class by Bier and Mark and Thompson have how time and social class, time and gender as well are connected, have shown that different group of people have different relationship to time, which can result in temporal inequality. Temporal inequality refers to the disparity in the amount and quality of time that people have, their autonomy over that time, as well as the way that time is valued and used in different contexts. So temporal inequality can affect various aspects of people's lives, such as their personal life, family life, their work, leisure, health, and well-being as well. So in this, one of the sectors where temporal inequality are particularly evident is the maritime logistic industry. Among them, seafarers are exposed to various forms of temporal injustice due to the uneven and unequal effect of the industry itself. So maritime logistics is influenced by global market forces, technological innovations, and regulatory frameworks, which create different temporal regimes and rhythm for seafarers, in this case specifically. So in this presentations, I will explore how temporal inequality affects the experiences of Vietnamese seafarers, who are among the most marginalized and exploited group in the seafaring industry. I will focus on three aspects of their experience, which are their pay, work conditions, and their longing and aspiration, which I call life course transitions in the slide here. To do so, I have used digital ethnography as a method, which involve, so I direct messages a lot of the seafarer while they are aboard ship in order to interview them, and also use social media, blogs, forum, and website to look at their posts as well. And so digital ethnography sort of allow me to access the voices and perspective of seafarer who are often invisible in the mainstream media as well as academic literature. So time and logistic. Time is an essential dimension of the human existence, but it's often overlooked in the study of human life, especially in the analysis of labor and racializations. So in the sections or the slide, I will examine how time influence and is influenced by logistics, which I consider the science of planning and executing movement of goods and people from one place to another. So the theoretical concepts that I'm trying to develop or operationalize here is the concept of logistical time, which is a specific temporal order that regulates the transport of goods and people around the world. So logistic as a dynamic and complex system is the hidden force that shapes supply chains, from the extraction of raw materials to the consumption of finished product. Logistics relies on the efficiency and accuracy, making it a time-sensitive industry. Time is crucial in every state of logistics, from production to distributions, from coordination to delivery. Time in logistics is not just about deadline, but it's also about the flow of goods and services through the supply chain, or to ensure that that flow goes smoothly, as Cohen have argued in her book. So several scholars have briefly discussed the importance of time and in logistics in their work. And Cohen have demonstrated that different temporal experience among different group of people, such as white master, slave, and indentured servant, can be a key factor in the operation of any logistical system, with significant consequences to both historical event and contemporary supply chain. So the temporal structure and logic of logistical time is that there are several temporal structure and logic that govern activity and practices of different group of people in logistics. So E.P. Thompson has shown that labor system have increasingly transitioned toward a time-oriented model that significantly affects the life of worker. Since the industrial revolutions, clock time has become the dominant temporal structure in most labor relationships. Clock time is driven by linear time and clock-based structures that shape people temporal and social practices. These structures are manifested in the use of deadline, just-in-time delivery system, and fiscal year schedule or pace labor activity. Clock time imposes rigid and uniform order that flows on the flows of event and activity and create a sense of urgency and pressure for workers to meet the demand of productivity and efficiencies, which not only influences the pace and rhythm of life, but also shape the way we pay attention to, how we attend to problem, and how we interpret phenomenon. The domination of clock time has also led to the emergence of network time as a temporal structure in the context of global flows of capital, commodity, and informations. Network time here is synchronizations and optimization of time through systems such as World Standard Time, Greenwich Mean Time, or Universal Time, and increasingly also by digital devices. Network time enable the instant and constant connectivity and accessibility of information, communications, transactions, and create a sense of simultaneity and immediacy across space. In the digital age, network time also enable the automations and algorithmizations of logistical operations such as inventory, distributions, delivery, and create a sense of efficiencies and reliability across space. So within the field of logistics, the manifestation of clock time and network time through the standardization and synchronization of time based on mechanical and digital devices such as clock, watches, computers, satellites, has significant consequences for the everyday life of seafarer and other logistic workers, which is what I'm focusing on here. Logistical time, which is a specific temporal structure that governs the transport of goods and people across the world, is influenced by both clock time and network time. Logistical time is not only a measure of durations, but also the measure of distance, speed, directions. It is not only a linear and sequential order, but also a cyclical and circular order. It is not only a global, universal standard, but also local and contextual as well. And it's include not only technical and rational calculation, but also social and cultural negotiations. So here, then I would argue logistical time is not only a resource, a constraint, but also a value and a meaning that's shaped and is shaped by the experiences of people who work in the field of logistics. So the factor that affects logistical time, there are various factors, such as the demand and supply of commodities, the availability and cost of shipping route, the speed and capacity of ship, the weather and sea conditions, the port operation and regulations, and the contractual agreement and legal obligations of seafarer and ship owner. In this case, where I'm talking about seafarer. Logistical time is closely connected to colonial and capitalist violence as it mirrors and reproduces the racialized and genders hierarchies and inequalities that underlies global division of labor and the exploitation of resources. The enforcement of Western logistical time reveals a systematic tendency toward the optimization of logistical processes for the fast transportation of goods at the expense of the devaluations and marginalization of racialized people. Logistical time also enact a form of contemporary displacement and dispossession through the allocation and priority not only of physical infrastructure for the movement of capital, but also the legal and institutional framework that incorporate historical mechanisms of violence, logistical formations, as Cohen argued, and I will show later on in this presentations. So then the logistical time affect the experiences and identity of logistic workers in this presentation, especially seafarers, who are often exposed to precarious and abusive working conditions, as well as to cultural and social isolation and detachment in their works. So the logistical time generate different temporal pattern and rhythm for workers depending on their position and role in the maritime logistics sector. For instance, seafarer, some work for short-term contract, while others work long-term contract. Some work on regular schedule, while others work on irregular schedule. Some work on fixed route, while others work on variable route, which all affect their work and ability to spend time with their family or have a personal life. Some seafarers work on fast ship, while others work on slow ship, others work on large ship, or some work on smaller ship. And these differences influence the quantity and the quality of time that seafarers have, their autonomy over their time, as well as the ways that their time is valued. Logistic workers encounter high pressure environments that demand complying with time constraints. Seafarer, dock worker, truck drivers, warehouse employees all struggle with the inflexible and demanding schedule. Time constraint also reflects the power imbalance in the logistics sector as multinational corporations and major retailers impose tight deadline and delivery window on their supplier, logistic provider, and all the supply chain actor. Moreover, capitalist system prioritization of profit and efficiency often lead to the unjust subordinations of human life to the demand of product productions and distribution. This means that worker and community are impacted by economic interests at the expense of their well-being. This can be seen in the unequal effect of digitalizations and automation in the field of logistics, as Jess has already presented earlier. So maritime logistics plays a crucial role in the exploitation of resources and material from colonized territory by facilitating the transportation of these resources and material across the globe, as we have always seen in the last 300 years. But then also seafarers from colonial territory offer cheap labor for the industry as colonial power extract the surplus value of their labor and movement. While the world trade is dependent on the extractive value of seafarer movement, their immobility is often the result of exploitation of the same colonial and capitalist system. As such, the displacement of racialized labor is the consequence and a condition of maritime shipping, as it involved the exploitations and discrimination of the worker who operate the ship, ports, and warehouse, as well as the people who are transported as commodity or migrants. The displacement of racialized labor is a consequent and condition of maritime shipping. And thus, through maritime shipping, logistical time can be seen as a process that drive and also create the uneven and unequal pattern of development and distributions. So then, here I want to focus on the fact that logistical time is also a process of what Harvey considered time-space compressions, which is the acceleration of the pace of life and the reduction of distance between places due to the development of transportation, communications, and production technologies. However, this process is also a form of time space expansion in which the creation of new distances and time that widen the gap and inequality between people and region as well, as argued by Katz. So this process enabled the expansion of markets, the accumulation of capital, and the domination of territory, but also create uneven geographic development, social inequality, and cultural conflicts. A different group of people and region experience time and space differently. So in this presentations, I focus specifically on the temporal inequality to the experience of Vietnamese seafarer, their contract term, their pay, and their longing, and their aspirations for the future. The seafaring industry and its workforce can provide a unique lens to the understanding of temporal inequality. So at the moment, there's about 1.9 million seafarers work in this industry, with about 1 million as rating, and the rest are officers. The Philippines, Russia, Indonesia, and China are the top supplier of seafarer, but they account for only about 35% of the total workforce. So here's a list of the top 10 seafarers supplied. As you can see, Vietnam is 9 out of 10, with a relatively small number. It is well known that there's a dual wage, as Khalili argues, it's well known that there's a dual wage system that favors seafarers from certain countries, mainly those from Europe, over those from Asia. Seafarers work across borders, but their pay and work depend on their nationality. The Philippines, China, and Indonesia provides the most ship labor globally, but they receive lower wages and work conditions than their European counterpart. As you can see here, I have a list of pay and positions for Vietnamese seafarers, the Philippines, Indian, and Russians. And the Vietnamese are among the lowest paid in the industry. So while Jones law in the US and similar law in Canada, which allow American seafarer to be paid the most, because all the ships that are have home port in the US have to employ Americans seafarer. Seafarer in the other countries are paid relatively low. For Vietnamese seafarer, the nationality of the ship owner also structure their pay. So here I have the salary by hours in US dollars for able-bodied seamen. As you can see, Vietnam is the lowest on the list. And then the ship owner nationality also structure the pay. As you see, Vietnamese domestic route usually pays the least, and then EU route or EU ship owner usually pays the most for Vietnamese seafarers. So these are all the second charges all the salary of Vietnamese seafarer, but on different ship with different owner. As so, in my fieldwork, I spoke to Tuấn, a relatively young seafarer at 30 years old. He had only been an actual seafarer for 5 years. During his first year at university, Tuấn won a scholarship to study at a maritime university in Russia. The training was welcomed by Tuấn, who also had to spend time learning Russian. However, when he graduated from the Russian university, because of his nationality, Vietnamese, he had to spend extra time and money to convert his license to the Vietnamese one. So the seafarer book, he had to spend time and money to convert the Russian one into the Vietnamese one. He also had sailed under the ship with Chinese owner, as well as ship with Indian management company with low pay. Currently sailing on a Japanese ship, Tuấn welcomed the better food, And according to him, better working hour, yet he cannot help that to feel a little bit unfair that his classmate at his Russian university earn more than he does. So this is a quote from him. Salary of Russian seafarers is around 50% higher than ours. I asked my friend the other day, the salary is significantly higher. Yet graduated from a Russian training program with good English skills, don't think that he's quite lucky. As he said, my current company, compared to other company in Vietnam, is in the top 1 or 2% in terms of pay. The salary for officer is still lower than Filipino, Indian, or Japanese officer, but the rating, such as AB and OS, have slightly higher salary. All the companies, they are pushing salary, seafarer salary down. They are saying that since COVID is over, the number of seafarers has increased. In this case, as time is not only a natural resource, it's also a social construct that reflects the power relation and value of different group of individuals. The fact that Tunn's time is valued less because of his nationality put him at the bottom of the racial hierarchy that placed whiteness at the top. However, wage inequality only provides a small picture of how temporal inequality configures seafarers' life. In my fieldwork, I have discovered that temporal inequality is an aspect that has figured into the life of Vietnamese seafarer before they even got a chance to be at sea. Vietnamese seafarers are mainly educated in 6 training institutions in Vietnam, 2 universities and 4 colleges. At the institution, the Seafarer Training Center that's provide basic safety, professional, and special training. The 2 leading maritime university in Vietnam are Maritime University and Vietnam Maritime University in the north, and Ho Chi Minh University of Transport in the south Vietnam. These universities are managed by 2 ministries, Ministry of Education and Training and the Ministry of Transport. Therefore, the training program in these institutions are designed to meet the regulations, the international regulations. Maritime students spend much of their time in the first 2 years, as you can see here, studying fundamental subjects, including political and communist-related course. The problem is that they have very little sea training, about 3 months each time in the whole total of 4 years. So you can see there's not a lot of sea training. And the same for students at colleges. So after completing 4 to 5 years of university training, most university students have to start their career as cadet again. However, in order to get a job as a cadet, most of the job requires that you have a university degree. So the stringent requirement for higher educations, which in the EU or in the US, is usually just a vocational training program, not a university education. So this requirement for higher education, as well as the next 2 years of studying to become a seafarer, mean that Vietnamese seafarers must constantly race against time to catch up to their counterpart in other countries. After 4 years of university education, most would start as a cadet aboard ship, with other seafarers who had only a high school education. Even then, most seafarers can only get job working for Chinese and Vietnamese owner. The only exception to this are the few lucky candidates who get recruited directly from training institution to Japanese ship under agreement, as you can see in the second picture, which I provided the translation, between the institution and Japanese ship owner. Even then, most start as cadet, which has the lowest pay in the world, about a few hundred euros a month for 10 hours a day, 7 days a week for several months. So when Tuấn was a 3rd officer, every 9 months at sea with the same company only earned him an extra 10 euros, a $10 salary increase. Now as a second officer, every 9 months at sea, Tuấn earn an extra $100 a month. On his second date as a second officer, Tuấn now earn $3,500 a month. This means that it would take him at least 13 years to catch up to the salary of his friend fresh out of training in Russia. But obviously, there are also structural conditions. So Vietnamese seafarer, most of the time, have to be hired through Vietnamese ship management company or crewing agency, which then forces them to accept lower pay as well as worse working condition. Moreover, many Vietnamese seafarers must pay at least 10 to 15% of their salary toward the crewing agency or the management company. So this system has created a layer of precarity for seafarers who cannot negotiate their own contract. In fact, this system resembles a system of recruitment for labor migrants in many countries. So here's what Tuấn said. Most companies hide their salary, plus the salary that they pay us would be different from the salary that they agree with the ship owner. Many companies would take a percentage of our salary. In some companies, seafarers have to pay a bribe if they want to get the next contract. Some keep our salary for a few months after we started working, then they would start paying. So then this structure too has held Tuấn back from competing with his classmate in Russia for the same job that they were trained for. Tuấn ability to get job is now limited by what kind of contract the Vietnamese ship management and crewing company can get. Which brings us to the next point, which is the working condition. So for most of the time, the contract written in language that put seafarer at a disadvantage already because overtime is often structured into the monthly payment. So for like say American or EU seafarer, overtime is not really structured into their monthly payment, but the sum that Vietnamese seafarer receive, as you see earlier, is the amount that included overtime and everything else. So they don't get any more money if they work overtime, doesn't matter how many hours. So Tuấn, like most Vietnamese seafarers, work a standard 10-hour day, 7 days a week with no overtime pay because it's already structured into their salary, which is quite low. Yet even when the contract are 10 hours, it is not uncommon for seafarers to have worked more. However, even in this case, the experience of work time is managed differently based on the nationality of the ship owner. Tuấn told me that with his current company, he worked 10 hours a day, which was easy compared to his previous ship, which was owned by an Indian owner. And so he said, there was day that I worked 20 hours. I only get a short break, then must wake up again. On days where working hours short, it is around 10 to 12 hours, but on average, it's about 14 to 16 hours. At this point, temporal inequality become embodied as well. Most seafarers I spoke to reported weight loss while at sea due to poor diet and long working hour. Tam also structured Vietnamese seafarer contract in another way. Tuấn had told me that his Russian friend contract usually only lasts 4 to 6 months, which is quite long compared to pilot, as Jess said, 7 on, 7 off. So meanwhile, a standard sea date or contract that Tuấn received for his current company, which is still considered one of the good ones, lasts 9 months. 9 months at sea out of the year mean that Tuấn can't date, can't even think about starting a family. He said that nowadays all the girls immediately avoid seafarer. It's not that Tuấn does not actively try to date or start the family. He even joined a group that focused on dating life for seafarer, hoping to find someone. But he has yet to find anyone who's willing to put up with his life of work. The long time at sea means that the delay of almost everything else in life compared to other Vietnamese seafarers. Tuấn, however, still have a relatively short contract. Most Vietnamese seafarers that work for Vietnamese and Chinese owned ship have a standard contract of 10 to 12 months. As salary on these ships are low, many seafarers are eager to go back to work after just 2 months off. Tuấn himself only takes 2 to 3 months off after every contract, working long hours and longer contract than other seafarers from other country who can enjoy shorter and more flexible schedule, mean that Vietnamese seafarers enjoy less autonomy, leisure, and family time, as they have less access to temporal resources and more constraint on their time than other groups. Which leads me to the next point, which is aspiration and longing, which has often come up during my conversation with Vietnamese seafarers. Their time on the ship is seen as a mean toward an end to fulfill their aspiration toward better pay, accumulating enough money to choose a different path, or even toward a better life. The future-oriented nature of their work help them cope with the harsh reality of the present. For them, doing a good job, putting in the hour, have a good work attitude, putting in the extra hour to improve their English occupational skill is not only about ascending the rank, but also about moving up the hierarchy of ship owner nationality. So one of my interlocutor, Bing, told me that I really hope we don't dock it during date holiday. We'll have to work normal schedule if we don't continue. And he would really like to enjoy the time to celebrate the holiday that's coming up. Being worked as the only electrician on a ship owned by an Indian company. He had graduated from the Maritime College in Haiphong. As an ETO, he has no chance to move up further on the hierarchy. And so I asked him what he does with his free time when he isn't working on the ship. He said as the only ETO, he's often busy and under a lot of pressure, but he spent his time learning English and reading manual for his job. As an ETO on an Indian ship, he's only earned $1,300 a month, significantly lower than what he could be earning for an EU ship. He believes that he's held back by his English skill and hope he can soon find a job joining an EU ship, which can give him a salary between $5,000 to $6,000 a month. Yet his aspiration was stopped short by his crew evaluation system, which is a digitalization that I want to focus on later on, not on this presentation, but he said that there was too many questions regarding technology he did not have experience in. He's still trying to learn, but the literature in Vietnamese for a new system are quite limited. The exam using AI technology to provide online assessment across seafarer competence, English language skill, ability, profiling, and personality testing has become really popular among crewing agency in Vietnam. So as more and more technology are being developed in the shipping industry, Vietnamese seafarer has fallen further behind in terms of training and must use their own time and resources to catch up if they want better salary. Speaking to seafarers in the last few months, I get a sense that they are very much aware of their situations and the hierarchy they are embedded in. So a captain told me that Vietnamese seafarer long for the salary of Filipino and Indian seafarer, and Filipino long for the salary of Russian seafarer, as if it's a race to get close to whiteness as close to whiteness as possible, which I call it proximity to whiteness. Temporal inequality is not just about the past or the present, but is about the temporal investment, referring to the action that they take happening in time, to which seafarers attempt to secure their future, and time horizon, referring to the possibility of whether they will reach their desired position or future. Bing has spent the last 10 years working as a seafarer, hoping to save enough money to buy a house and have a saving to start a business back home. For now, he longs for home as he has spent the last 8 months on the ship. He said he doesn't like the food and lose quite a bit of weight while he aboard the ship. He hoped that going home means that he will be able to gain some weight. Tuấn too is hoping that the ship won't dock during the date holiday, as that means that they will have to work instead of being able to celebrate the holidays. This is one of the times when working with a full Vietnamese crew has its perk. because they can cook together, enjoy the holiday together. Tuấn aspired to make captain someday, making double what he makes now. In the meantime, a Vietnamese captain I spoke to is trying his best to get into an EU or US training program to become a pilot or a surveyor, hoping that he will have a more favorable working conditions. Yet his horizon, like Tuấn Bing, is limited by his nationality, because most EU or US training program require surveyor or pilot to have the nationality of those countries where the program is located. The Vietnamese seafarer, being racialized, then are out of sync with their peer from other country who has better opportunity, pay, and working condition. They also out of sync with their family and community who they don't have time to spend with. They are out of sync with their own aspiration and potential, as they are limited by the system that exploit and discriminate them. So then this presentation focus on the temporal dimension of racialization that affect pay and work of Vietnamese seafarer. Due to the structural constraint of their training and employment, seafarers start their career later than their counterpart in other country. They also receive lower pay, worse working condition, which means they have to work longer and harder to achieve the same level of income and recognitions as seafarer from other country. Time, in this sense, is not only money but also measured is also a measure of value and worth. Temporal disparity thus require racialized workers to invest more physical, emotional, and mental labor while having less time to reap the reward of their work. This labor also includes coping with racism, racialization, and discrimination, which are often hidden and ignored in the prevailing system of time. Racialized workers, however, cannot overlook or erase these experiences as it affects their life and identity deeply. Vietnamese seafarer, because of being racialized, are out of sync, and they have scarce time to bond with family, friend, community. They also must adapt to new skill and technology needed for modern ship, which they don't have access to. With this presentation, I was hoping to demonstrate is the significance of the temporal dimensions of racializations in understanding logistic labor for seafarer, as well as in the future, I hope, for other logistic workers as well. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much. That was great. I know it's getting a little late there in Rotterdam, but does anyone have any questions? If you have any questions, you could raise your hand. We could, if multiple people have questions, maybe we could hear them all, just and then see if any responses come forth. Maybe there are no questions. I'll just hold for a second. You can, if you raise your hand, I can allow you to talk, attendees, if you have any questions. Well, if not, I don't want to, I don't want to keep you both, because I know it is getting late, but I just, thought I might say just a couple things that I had as questions. And if you'd like to respond, a little bit, that'd be great. But otherwise we can, continue this conversation in other places in the future. But just thinking about, first off, I love Out of Sync. I love thinking about, your framing of temporal inequality, the literature you brought, Jessica, I think is, incredibly valuable to think about, that dimension as, sort of foundational to the kind of lived reality of, seafarers and people in different kinds of logistical roles that, obviously the economic, stories tell part of that, but then, the sort of, the temporal dimension, thinking about, I can't date, I can't start a family because, I'm at sea for 9 months, right? That also then connects to other, different kinds of industries. I think about, oil workers or truck drivers, right? That temporal dimension as a way to unite those different threads, I think is quite interesting and productive. In Jess's presentation, first off, this pilot tracker site is super interesting. And I also immediately thought, I was like, oh, is this like an Uber, right? Where the pilot has like a wearable, or phone that's like telling them, do this, do that. It's so interesting that it's not that, right? That it's the, in some ways, most low-tech solution possible, right? Like, oh, hit this button now. But the thing that it made me think about was, the common themes that we have when we talk about, the critical study of logistics around questions of transparency and visualization, and the tensions there, right, between, different kinds of transparency. And yeah, I wondered if you had anything to say about, how transparency is both bad and good, right? That they are, sort of pressured because now the delay is visible, or a perceived delay might be visible to some stakeholder, at a very different kind of class position who's observing this process, versus, what is the kind of most base raw visibility, right, that they get out of, oh, pilots are a job that exists here, and we can now see these people, and then of course not see all the other people, right, that are the people that are just rendered part of the ship icon, I guess, right, from this system. But you mentioned, the potential of, thinking about how these systems could be used by pilots in terms of offering actual flexibility to their needs in terms of scheduling. One of the themes that we have is, justice here. And like, is it possible to imagine some kind of, stakeholder interaction with people like pilots, right, where they are actually contributing to these systems, or is that unimaginable? So that's, I guess, my big question. Before you answer, Jane has a question, so I'll allow Jane to talk, and then you can answer both of these questions as you like. Jane, can you?
Hi, thank you
Hi.
so much. Oh, I can turn my camera on. Oh, no, I can't. Okay.
No, sorry, just audio, I guess. Yeah.
Totally fine. I just don't like, people don't want to talk to a black square. I have a sort of related question a little bit, which is, what is how does this company present do they try to hide the fact that it's manual, or are they quite transparent about it? Because from my perspective, or my my assumptions is that a lot of these companies are still super risk averse, so that they might be actually quite happy that it's manual, because they want to know how the information gets transmitted, or is it something that the company tries to obscure a little bit? And then my second question is, I noticed on their website that they're a B Corp, and I'm really curious about, I'm just really curious about how they relate to that, given, given what B Corps are responsible for, and do they have these kinds of conversations internally? Do they talk about, like you say, the kind of, do they seem interested in having the pilots contribute to the development of the service, or are they somebody who they're just we don't have that kind of team? Or is it that they're just actively not interested because that's not who buys the product? They sort of, the customer is the company, not the pilot. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and Jessica, I don't know if you want to speak first, or do you want me to go? What do you think?
I am not actually sure what the question that Matthew was trying to ask was. So I think you should speak first and then
Go first, and then we'll figure it. Yeah. So then maybe I'll take both of those, and then we can see where it goes. To the first question, yeah, it was interesting how quickly things like transparency became central, because that wasn't something that I was really looking at and thinking about, sort of like the promise, but also the politics of visibility. Because anytime you want to think, okay, could this actually be used for something that they might benefit from, you're immediately you butt up against yeah, but also if the data exists, then something bad is going to happen with it. Because that is just sort of the lesson that's been learned, in the past couple of decades. But I don't think it's impossible because I mean, a lot of the things too, that Jessica was talking about, people mitigate loneliness by Skyping or Zooming with their family, you know, or getting on WhatsApp and video calling their family. People mitigate longing by talking to each other online, people in similar positions, sharing salaries, you know, so it's not, there are ways that this tech is already being used against the grain that I think are also, I think, relatable in other industries. But I do think that if you want to make something that's different, the downside is just that you really have to go to the bare bones. Like, you can't just sort of slap an app or a website together and have people put stuff in a Google form, because of course Google has its own data management practices. And I was like, yeah, if you wanted to do it responsibly, you really have to look at like every step in the development of something, you know. And of course there are people who I think have made starts in terms of doing that, like when thinking about migration in the US, or also, you know, and also been prosecuted for it, of course. So it's not impossible, but it is important to think really about how deeply these ecosystems and how extensively these ecosystems run, and think like maybe giving them a way to talk where it's not being monitored is already something, and that's not actually that hard to do per se, if you're a developer, you know, software developer. But I do think it's worthwhile to not just, because also a lot of the sort of abuses are things like the labor abuses are things that are open secrets in the shipping industry, like they're well known. So if we're going to outline that, there are different perspectives that you can give, and I think we're trying to do a bit of that. But also it's worth thinking about, okay, but like, could there be a good job on board a ship? Like, is that a thing that could even happen? I think it's kind of an open question, right? Like, what does that mean? What kind of ship? How big is the ship? Where is it going? But I think you very quickly run up against questions of like, what is a valuable way to spend your life? And I think in any critique of capitalism, it's worth asking that, and also asking that to your interlocutors, because you know, a lot of the bad things are widely known. So what can we do? Also, as academics trying to like do research responsibly, is there something we can do for them? And, you know, like people ask, like Jessica, you know that too. They ask you all the time, like, can you do this for me? Can you get me a job in Europe? Can you sponsor, you know, like, and like at some point, you know, there are limits on what we can do, but also like, it's not completely limited. Like, it's not 100%. So I think it's worth thinking about that as well. And I don't know, Matt, your perspective. But just saying like, you know, the data makes them vulnerable, I think isn't enough. I think we can say, yeah, what would data look like if it didn't do that? And there's probably a way to make, you know, to make that happen. For Jane's question, it's so one of the things when thinking about like the reproduction of whiteness is that on the one hand, a lot of people know about the inequalities in the shipping industry. They, you know, they know people come from a lot of different countries and are treated differently based on a whole host of factors, all of them tied to race in one way or the other, or nearly many of them, I should say, not 100%, but there isn't a space for even discussing those questions. So one of the things I've been thinking about, like going to meetings and stuff, in trainings is, yeah, it's much more the case where they just think we have to build this, who's going to pay for it, what do they want? So labor isn't really even, and like that's interesting in Rotterdam, right? Because there's a whole history, kind of like if you think about like, you know, ports historically, there's a whole history of labor organizing and unionization after World War, you know, prior to, but also after World War II. And now, I mean, even here, the shipping union is so institutionalized that to talk about labor, to talk about what workers want, even for very privileged workers like pilots, it's not even that. It's like, if you brought it up, it would be like wanting to talk about like a rhinoceros. Like it would be ridiculous. So that in and of itself is kind of interesting, because it's like, there's no way to have that conversation. The discourse doesn't allow it. Yeah. And so they do care, but also they can't even like begin. So that to me is kind of, and also you see that a lot like in sustainability discussions about shipping. And that too is they're like, yeah, we need to, you know, like make things safe for everyone. You're like, who's everyone? And they're like, we don't know, you know, like, but it's not that they don't out of the box. Like, so the kinds of things I'm studying, it's not people with like devil horns being like, let's kill everybody, right? Like, but they're going, we want to make the world better, but then their world doesn't include seafarers, period. Even though they know they're there and they talk to them and they see that, you know, yeah. So that phenomenon by itself is kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I think it's something that's really interesting to me. I work on subsea cables, and one of the things I did, I randomly like have a friend who is now a maritime lawyer, and I just asked him like, hey, can you walk me through the process of what happens when a cable is broken by an anchor? So it's an accidental cable break. It was like 2 hours. And I don't even think we'd gotten to court. But one of the things he talked about was like, you go onto the ship and you interview the crew, and he talked about like the dynamics of interviewing the crew about what happened. And I was just really told me a story about like a crew member who said like if they all have the exact same story, sometimes it's like suspicious. And sometimes they're not in a position to tell you the truth. And he said like he once had a guy, no, it wasn't him, it was one of his colleagues, like had a guy come up and say like, okay, actually didn't happen, like everyone told you. And they just like had to kind of bustle him off the ship and away so he didn't get like physically punished or killed. And this made me really curious because I'm like, what the like the labor practices in the maritime industry, like it's not something that I'm specifically looking at in my work, but it's like, oh, okay, actually it's really relevant. Like it's not, they come up against everything. But I was really, so I was just really curious about that, and that, like these companies aren't maybe like, they're not sitting there with devil horns, but there are situations where the labor practices need more attention.
Yeah, and there is really this character of the industry in that sense that a lot of even like the IMO, which in theory protects, the International Maritime Organization, which is the UN body, right? That you would know, as you would know. Like they're just captured by the industry. Like there's no, even the lip service isn't even lip service to labor, like, and it doesn't mean that there aren't people in the IMO who care, but like their ability to actually do something is, their hands are so tied that it's, And so that's also, I think, that's part of the thing is that, you don't have to have the devil horns for people to still die.
No, exactly.
Right? And looking at those, and also for the data scientists too, like on the one hand, they're not even talking about labor abuses, but on the other hand, you ask someone a story like, oh, what happened to that sensor? And they're like, oh yeah, like there was a guy who came off and they smashed it. So we deported him, obviously, like you very quickly end up like at violence and despair, despite the fact that you can't name it. And that's its own. So the connections are so tight, even though the discourse is so disjointed. That is super interesting though, that story.
But I'm also curious about the software though, about this, like, and this is like whether the manual nature of the turning the ship pink is something that the customer knows about, or if it's just like they don't care.
Oh yeah, that was the first. So my impression, and that's actually something I need to do a lot more field work on in terms of like the nuts and bolts, but my impression is, and I don't know, that when they're telling people like from liner companies, so like sort of internally, but not internally to the Port Authority, internally in terms of customers, they're transparent about how it works, but when they're sort of using it for publicity for the port, they hype it as if it's much more than it is. So they sort of, there's really like an internal external approach. So like the people who need to know, because they have to tell them what they're paying for, but in terms of the broader public, because there's often a lot of like publicity around the port, and they have public open days and things like that, like the harbor days. They kind of just show what it is, and they don't talk about how it works at all. And then you totally would think that like there's a wearable, or there's something, or it's automated, or so they're not emphasizing that the dispatcher is like basically the thing.
I think I'm a little curious because I would suspect that these industries are also quite risk averse. So the idea that it's a person wouldn't put them off.
Exactly. Yeah, because for the customers, they go, oh yeah, well, we're not using anything too weird, and they go, oh, thank God.
Yeah,
because you don't want to break
my ship. Like
they're risk averse, and also, I mean, in some sense, technophobic. Like in terms of the higher ups, the people who are paying, like they don't want a thing that's hard for them to use. That's also why it's like a website. You go there, it turns pink, you're done. Like, so that's also kind of interesting, the technological literacy.
So Yeah, thank you, Jane. Yeah, I want to guard everyone's time here because we are slightly over. Yeah, it was I guess more of a comment than a question for for Jessica. But yeah, it just your talk just made me think a lot, about that time dimension, particularly in terms of organizing, right? Thinking about the history of carving out, the weekend and all these, time as, the central object of, organizing, not, the sort of, the pay, right? How time has played that role in different ways. And we've seen that role, I'm thinking in the US about the railroad workers, and what they really wanted was time, right? That's what they wanted. But you can't really give them time because the system's not set up with, any kind of temporal flexibility, right? So yeah, it's not really a well-formed question, but I think very, valuable direction to think about articulating, this temporal dimension, further thinking more deeply about temporal inequality, I think has a lot of potential from the organizing perspective, because that is something that workers want, right? Workers want better, not just more time, but better quality time, right? I think you put that, very nicely, that quality is a critical dimension there.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that this really stand out for Vietnamese seafarers, they don't have unions, and they want to form a union, but they cannot form a union because the government does not allow them to form a union in a way. And also, they've talked a lot about corruptions and how this has perpetuated the system where they have, 10 to 12 months contract, which so the seafarer that I spoke to was saying that when they talk to pilot or seafarer from European country, they were just shocked because they've never had anybody who spent 12 months on the ship. And this really basically affected them in a way that a lot of people complain about. Not if they have a family, they cannot see their children grow up. And so all those quality time is just missing from their life. And the ship become this space where time is very slow, but outside time is moving. So they are out of sync with everything. But then in the perspective of ship owner, which is a very powerful force in the seafaring industry, I think, is that when you can keep somebody aboard for 12 months, it saves them money, it saves them time, because every time that the ship dock and they change crew, they have to teach this person how to, get involved with the crew again. So it's sort of at this point, what I see is that it's the sacrifice of human life and well-being over the operation of the ship. And so, yeah, it's kind of the idea where temporal inequalities then kick in.
Yeah. Well, thank you both again so much. Thank you everyone who was able to attend today and is still here. Just as a reminder, our next event is Wednesday, February 21st at 12 p.m. And I hope to see some of you there. So thanks so much. I'm gonna kick everybody out for just 1 second so I could talk to the panelists for a minute. But
and thank you,
yeah.
Matt.
Oh,
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you, and thank everyone for joining us.